On a cold night in 1997, in a small town where everyone knew each other, a young woman went missing without warning, and investigators had no answers. More than 15 years later, one small detail reopened the case, and it exposed a dark secret. Massillon, Ohio, was the kind of town that lived and breathed for Friday nights in the autumn. The air would turn crisp, smelling faintly of fallen leaves and stadium popcorn, and the entire community would shut down their businesses just to gather under the bright halogen lights of the high school football stadium. It was a place where generations of families stayed rooted, where neighbors waved from their front porches, and where violent crime was something that happened in other places. In this tight-knit community, 17-year-old Delaney Vance was a familiar and beloved face. Delaney was in her senior year at Massillon High. She was a varsity cheerleader, a bright student with dreams of studying nursing in college, and the kind of girl who always seemed to have a warm, genuine smile for everyone she met. She lived in a modest, single-story house near the edge of town with her mother, Lorraine, and her 14-year-old brother, Toby. Lorraine was a single mother who worked long hours as a manager at a local grocery store to keep the family afloat. Delaney was her rock. She helped Toby with his math homework, cooked dinner when Lorraine was working late shifts, and brought a constant, radiant energy into their small home. Lorraine often looked at her daughter with a deep sense of pride, amazed at the thoughtful, responsible young woman she was becoming. The autumn of 1997 was supposed to be a season of celebration. It was senior year, the football team was on a winning streak, and the town was buzzing with energy. Delaney was dadding the team's star quarterback, a handsome but somewhat arrogant senior named Cameron Pierce. To the rest of the school, they were the perfect couple, the king and queen of the Friday night lights. But in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Lorraine noticed a subtle shift in her daughter. Delaney seemed slightly on edge. She would occasionally jump when the landline phone rang in the kitchen, and she had started pulling the living room curtains shut as soon as the sun went down. When Lorraine gently asked if everything was all right, Delaney just brushed it off with a tired smile, blaming the stress of college applications and the busy cheerleading schedule. Lorraine trusted her daughter completely, so she didn't push the issue. It was a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Friday, October 17, 1997, began like any other game day in Massillon. The town was covered in orange and black banners. Delaney woke up early, made pancakes for Toby, and spent an extra 20 minutes in the bathroom perfectly curling her blonde hair and tying in her thick cheerleading ribbons. Before she walked out the front door, she gave her mother a tight hug. She told Lorraine that after the game she was going to the Beacon, a popular local diner where the whole school went to celebrate. She promised she would be home by midnight. Lorraine smiled, told her to drive safe, and watched her daughter walk down the driveway and climb into her faded blue sedan. That was the last time Lorraine Vance ever saw her daughter's face. The football game that night was a massive event. The stadium was packed with thousands of cheering fans. The marching band played loudly, the autumn air was freezing, and the energy was electric. Delaney was on the sidelines, laughing with her friends, tossing her pom-poms into the air, and cheering as Cameron threw 2 touchdown passes. Massillon High won the game in a total blowout. When the final buzzer sounded at 10 o'clock, the stadium erupted in celebration. The post-game routine was always chaotic. Players rushed the field, students crowded the exit gates, and parents lingered in the bleachers. According to her friends, Delaney stayed near the edge of the field for about 20 minutes after the game ended. She was seen talking to Cameron near the chain-link fence by the locker rooms. A few students later told police that the conversation looked a bit tense. Cameron seemed frustrated, waving his hands, while Delaney kept shaking her head and looking away. But it didn't look like a serious fight, just a typical teenage argument. A few minutes later, Cameron jogged into the locker room with the rest of the team. Delaney walked over to her group of friends near the concession stand. She seemed perfectly fine, maybe a little quiet, but she was smiling. She told her best friend, Chloe, that she was going to walk out to her car in the student parking lot to drop off her heavy cheer bag and grab her purse. She said she would meet them at the Beacon Diner in 15 minutes to get milkshakes and fries. Chloe told her to hurry up because the booths were going to fill up fast. Delaney laughed, zipped up her heavy varsity jacket to block the cold wind, and walked away toward the dark parking lot at the back of the school. At 10:45, Chloe and the rest of the cheerleaders were crammed into a large corner booth at the Beacon. The diner was packed, loud, and completely full of high school students, but Delaney wasn't there. By 11:15, Chloe started to wonder what was taking so long. She asked Cameron, who had arrived at the diner with his teammates around 11, if he knew where Delaney was. Cameron just shrugged, drinking a soda, and said he hadn't seen her since they talked by the field. He assumed she had just gone home because she was tired. The friends brushed it off, figuring Delaney just wasn't in the mood to deal with the noisy crowd. Back at the Vance house, the house was completely quiet. Lorraine had worked a long shift and fallen asleep on the living room couch while watching the late-night news. The glowing green numbers on the VCR clock read 1:30 in the morning when Lorraine suddenly woke up with a sharp, terrible feeling in her chest. The house was too quiet. She walked down the hallway and pushed open Delaney's bedroom door. The room was empty. The bed was perfectly made. Lorraine felt a sudden cold knot form in her stomach. Delaney was a very responsible girl. She never, ever broke her curfew without calling the house first. Lorraine walked into the kitchen and picked up the heavy wall phone. Her hands were shaking as she dialed Chloe's home number. Chloe's mother answered, groggy and confused, and handed the phone to her daughter. When Chloe told Lorraine that Delaney had never even made it to the diner, the cold knot in Lorraine's stomach turned to pure panic. Lorraine didn't wait. She grabbed her coat and her car keys, leaving a note on the counter for Toby in case he woke up, and drove out into the dark, freezing night. She drove straight to the Beacon Diner. The neon sign was still buzzing, but the parking lot was completely empty. The diner had closed an hour ago. She drove down Main Street, scanning the sidewalks, praying to see Delaney's faded blue sedan pulled over on the side of the road with a flat tire. But the streets of Massillon were completely deserted. At 3 in the morning, terrified and desperate, Lorraine drove to the local police station. The night desk sergeant saw the absolute terror in her eyes and immediately called for a patrol car to start checking the routes between the high school, the diner, and the Vance home. A missing teenager on a Friday night was usually written off as a runaway or a kid sneaking out to a party. But Lorraine's frantic insistence that this was completely out of character for Delaney made the officers pay attention. As the sun began to rise on Saturday morning, casting a pale, gray light over the town, a patrol officer slowly drove through the massive, empty parking lot of Massillon High School. Most of the lot was bare, the painted white lines covered in a thin layer of morning frost. But parked all the way in the back corner, near the edge of the dense woods that bordered the school property, was a single vehicle. It was Delaney's faded blue sedan. The officer radioed it in and stepped out of his cruiser. The air was bitterly cold. He walked cautiously toward the car, his boots crunching loudly on the frosted asphalt. The car was parked perfectly within the white lines. The engine was completely cold. The driver's side door was unlocked. The officer pulled a flashlight from his belt and shined it through the driver's side window. The interior of the car looked completely undisturbed. Delaney's heavy cheer bag was sitting on the floorboard of the passenger side. Her purse, containing her driver's license and a few crumpled dollar bills, was sitting right in the center console. But it was what the officer saw resting on the driver's seat that made his stomach drop. It was Delaney's heavy varsity cheer jacket. It was the same jacket she had zipped up to block the cold wind when she walked away from her friends just hours earlier. The jacket was neatly folded, placed squarely on the driver's seat, but the car keys were completely missing. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. The officer quickly backed away from the vehicle, immediately requesting backup and a detective to the scene. Leaving a purse behind was strange, but folding a warm jacket and leaving it in a freezing car while disappearing into the night defied all logic. Within an hour, the quiet school parking lot was swarming with police tape, forensic technicians, and a veteran investigator named Detective Aris Gable. Detective Gable was a calm, meticulous man who had worked in law enforcement for 20 years. When he arrived at the scene, he carefully inspected the area around the car. There was no broken glass. There were no signs of a struggle. There was no blood, and there were no drag marks on the frosty pavement. It was as if Delaney had walked to her car, opened the door, folded her jacket, and simply vanished into the freezing autumn air. But as Detective Gable leaned closer to inspect the exterior of the vehicle, his eyes caught something strange near the bottom of the driver's side window. Stuck to the cold glass, smeared slightly by the morning frost, was a distinct set of handprints. But they weren't the small, delicate handprints of a teenage girl trying to open her door. They were the large, heavy handprints of a man, and based on the angle and the direction of the smeared fingers, the person hadn't been leaning against the car casually. They had been standing outside, pressing their hands violently against the glass, looking in. The sight of those large, smeared handprints on the frosty glass completely changed the atmosphere in the dark parking lot. Detective Gable immediately ordered his officers to step back and expand the perimeter. The forensic team carefully dusted the driver's side window with dark powder, lifting the prints before the morning sun could melt the frost and wash away the evidence. The position of the handprints told a terrifying story. The fingers were pointing downward, the palms pressed hard against the glass near the bottom of the window frame. Someone tall and heavy had been standing outside Delaney's car, leaning over aggressively, pressing their weight against the window while looking down at whoever was sitting in the driver's seat. Just as the technicians finished lifting the prints, a police cruiser pulled into the parking lot, its tires screeching against the cold pavement. Delaney Vance stumbled out of the backseat before the car even came to a complete stop. When she saw the bright yellow police tape surrounding her daughter's faded blue sedan, her knees simply gave out. 2 officers had to catch her before she hit the asphalt. Her agonizing cries echoed through the empty school campus, a sound so filled with pure, devastating heartbreak that several of the veteran officers had to look away. Detective Gable walked over to Lorraine, gently wrapping a thick wool blanket around her shivering shoulders. Through heavy tears, Lorraine looked at the neatly folded varsity jacket sitting on the driver's seat. She grabbed the detective's arm, her fingers digging into his coat, and told him that Delaney would never leave that jacket behind. It was her favorite piece of clothing, and the night had been bitterly cold. If she was running away or walking to a friend's house, she would have worn it. The fact that it was folded and left behind meant Delaney had expected to be sitting comfortably inside her warm car. It meant she hadn't planned on leaving the vehicle at all. By noon on Saturday, the Massillon police station was operating at maximum capacity. Detective Gable's first priority was the most obvious person of interest, Cameron Pierce, the star quarterback and Delaney's boyfriend. In almost every case of a missing teenage girl, the boyfriend is the first suspect. Cameron was brought into the station wearing his heavy Letterman jacket, looking pale, exhausted, and incredibly nervous. The arrogance he usually carried around the high school was completely gone, replaced by the genuine fear of a teenager sitting in a sterile police interrogation room. Gable sat across from Cameron, placed a tape recorder on the metal table, and began asking about the argument they had after the football game. The witnesses had seen Cameron waving his hands in frustration, and Gable needed to know exactly what was said. Cameron swallowed hard, his voice shaking as he explained the tension between them. He admitted that he was angry, but he swore he had never laid a hand on her. According to Cameron, Delaney had been acting strangely for the past 3 weeks. She was constantly distracted, she stopped returning his pages, and she always seemed to be looking over her shoulder. Cameron, driven by teenage jealousy, assumed she was secretly talking to another boy. After the game, he had confronted her by the chain-link fence, demanding to know what she was hiding. But Cameron told Detective Gable that Delaney didn't look guilty when he accused her. Instead, she looked absolutely terrified. She had tears in her eyes, shook her head, and told him that she couldn't explain it yet, but that it had nothing to do with another boy. She promised to tell him everything at the diner later that night, and then she walked away. Gable pressed hard, looking for holes in the story, but Cameron's alibi was completely unbreakable. When Delaney walked away toward the dark parking lot at 10:20, Cameron jogged into the locker room with the rest of the football team. Over 20 players, 2 assistant coaches, and the head coach all confirmed that Cameron was inside the locker room for the next 25 minutes, showering and changing clothes. At 10:45, he walked out to his truck with 3 of his teammates and drove straight to the Beacon Diner, where dozens of students saw him walk through the front doors. It was physically impossible for Cameron to have been in the dark parking lot pressing his hands against Delaney's window. With the boyfriend cleared, the police turned their attention to a massive community search. The town of Massillon effectively shut down. Over 500 volunteers gathered at the high school football field on Sunday morning. They formed long, organized lines, walking shoulder to shoulder through the dense woods behind the school property, searching the banks of the local creek, and scouring the old, rusted train tracks at the edge of town. Helicopters flew low over the bare autumn trees, while local businesses printed thousands of missing person flyers bearing Delaney's smiling cheerleading photo. Detective Gable brought in specialized search and rescue bloodhounds from the state police division. The handlers let the dogs sniff Delaney's folded varsity jacket, hoping they would pick up a trail leading into the woods or down the street. But what the dogs did next was incredibly chilling. They circled the blue sedan twice, sniffing the cold asphalt near the driver's side door, and then simply sat down, refusing to move any further. They didn't bark, and they didn't pull on their leashes. The handlers explained the grim reality to Detective Gable. The scent didn't fade away into the woods. It just stopped dead on the pavement. This proved Delaney did not walk away from her car. She was either pulled into, or willingly stepped into, another vehicle right there in the parking lot. The investigation quickly shifted to the handprints found on the glass. The forensic laboratory rushed the processing, running the large fingerprints through every state and national database available in 1997. Detective Gable waited anxiously by his desk, hoping for a match that would blow the case wide open. But the results were deeply frustrating. The prints were not in the system. They didn't belong to Cameron, they didn't belong to any of the school faculty, and they didn't belong to anyone with a criminal record in the state of Ohio. The biggest piece of physical evidence they had was a complete dead end. As the days turned into weeks, the bright energy of the town faded into a suffocating gloom. The missing person flyers taped to the storefront windows began to curl and fade in the freezing winter rain. Lorraine stopped going to work. She sat in her quiet living room for hours, staring out the front window, waiting for headlights to pull into the driveway. Toby, Delaney's younger brother, became completely withdrawn. He refused to eat, sitting by the kitchen phone day and night, hoping to hear his sister's voice. The devastating reality of a cold case began to settle over the Vance family like a heavy blanket. The police had no suspects, no vehicle descriptions, and no idea why a beloved teenage cheerleader had been targeted. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. 6 weeks after the football game, Detective Gable was sitting alone in the station's evidence room. The case was slowly grinding to a halt, but Gable refused to let it go. He had the boxes of Delaney's personal belongings spread out across a large metal table. He had already gone through her school locker, her bedroom, and the contents of her car dozens of times. He was desperate to find something, anything, that could explain why Delaney had been acting so terrified in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. He picked up the heavy, black and orange cheerleading bag that had been found resting on the passenger floorboard of her car. Forensics had already emptied it, cataloging her pom-poms, a spare pair of socks, a water bottle, and a hairbrush. Gable turned the empty canvas bag over in his hands, feeling the thick, durable material. As he ran his fingers along the reinforced bottom of the bag, he felt something rigid hidden beneath the fabric. Gable grabbed a small pocket knife from his belt and carefully sliced through the interior nylon lining at the bottom of the bag. Hidden underneath the false bottom, deliberately tucked away where no one would ever accidentally find it, was a small, sealed envelope. Gable's heart began to race. He put on a pair of fresh latex gloves and carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single piece of plain white printer paper, folded tightly into a small square. He unfolded the paper and laid it flat on the metal table under the bright fluorescent lights of the evidence room. It was a typed note. It wasn't written by a friend and it wasn't a school assignment. It was a clear, direct, and terrifying threat. The message was only 2 sentences long. It read, "I know what you did last summer, and I have the photographs to prove it. Meet me at your car after the game tonight, or I show them to the police." Detective Gable stared at the typed words, a cold chill running down his spine. The entire narrative of the case had just violently shifted. Delaney hadn't been kidnapped by a random stranger passing through town. She had been extorted. She was terrified for 3 weeks because someone was blackmailing her over a secret so dark that she was willing to walk out to a freezing, empty parking lot alone just to keep it hidden. And somewhere out there, the mysterious photographs mentioned in the note were the key to finding her killer. The discovery of the typed blackmail note hidden inside Delaney's cheerleading bag completely shifted the entire investigation, but it also created an agonizing brick wall for the police. Detective Gable knew that Delaney was hiding a massive secret about something that had happened over the summer, but he had absolutely no idea what that secret was. The police spent months tearing through Delaney's life. They interviewed every single student she had spent time with during the summer of 1997. They subpoenaed records from every local photo processing lab in the county, hoping to find a clerk who remembered developing the mysterious blackmail photographs mentioned in the note. They found absolutely nothing. Whatever Delaney had done, and whoever had photographed her doing it, remained entirely hidden in the shadows. Without any new evidence, the momentum of the investigation slowly began to die. The massive search parties faded, the news vans left town, and the faded missing person flyers eventually washed away in the winter snow. The year 1997 came to a close, leaving the Vance family trapped in a permanent state of unresolved grief. 15 long years passed. The world moved forward into the year 2012. Massillon, Ohio, slowly modernized. The high school built a new football stadium, new businesses replaced the old ones on Main Street, and the tragedy of the missing cheerleader faded into a local urban legend. But for the Vance family, time had completely stopped on that freezing October night. Lorraine's hair had turned entirely gray. She still lived in the same modest house, refusing to change her landline phone number just in case her daughter ever tried to call home. Toby Vance, who had been just 14 years old when his older sister vanished, was now a 29-year-old man. The tragedy had profoundly shaped his life. Instead of moving away to start a new life in another city, Toby chose to stay right there in Massillon. He went to college, earned his teaching degree, and returned to Massillon High School to become a history teacher. He walked the same busy hallways his sister had once walked, teaching students who were the exact same age Delaney was when her life was stolen. Toby was a dedicated teacher, but he carried a heavy, silent sadness with him every single day. He had never stopped looking for answers. In the spring of 2012, Massillon High School was preparing to celebrate its 100th anniversary. To prepare for the massive alumni event, the school administration decided to create a digital archive of the town's history. They asked for teacher volunteers to help clear out the old basement storage rooms, which were packed with decades of dusty yearbooks, school newspaper clippings, and boxes of undeveloped camera film. Toby immediately volunteered to lead the project. He spent his afternoons in the quiet, windowless basement library, surrounded by the heavy smell of old paper and dust. For weeks, Toby sat at a small desk illuminated by a single desk lamp, carefully feeding long strips of old camera negatives into a high-resolution digital scanner. The process was slow and tedious, but it was incredibly important to the school's history department. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon in early May, Toby opened a rusted metal filing cabinet tucked all the way in the back corner of the storage room. Inside the bottom drawer, he found a thick, yellowed manila envelope. Written on the front of the envelope in faded black marker were the words, "Varsity Football Candidates, October 1997, unpublished." Toby's heart suddenly skipped a beat. October 1997. It was the exact month and year his sister had vanished, and the envelope belonged to a former student photographer who was famous around the school for taking hundreds of rapid-fire, candid photos during the football games. Because printing photographs was expensive in the 90s, the school yearbook only developed a handful of the best shots. The rest of the film had simply been dumped into this envelope and forgotten for 15 years. His hands were trembling slightly as he pulled the long, dark strips of camera negatives from the envelope. He gently wiped away 15 years of dust with a microfiber cloth and fed the first strip into the digital scanner. The machine whirred loudly in the quiet room. A loading bar appeared on his computer monitor. Toby held his breath, staring unblinkingly at the screen. Slowly, the negative film was converted into a crisp, black and white digital image. The computer screen lit up with a high-resolution photograph of the Massillon High football field. The stands were packed with cheering fans. Toby quickly fed another strip into the machine, and then another. He watched as the ghosts of 1997 appeared on his screen. He saw Cameron Pierce throwing a football. He saw the marching band standing in formation. And then, on the 42nd photograph of the reel, Toby saw her. It was a candid shot of the cheerleading squad standing on the sidelines during the third quarter of the game. Delaney was right in the center of the frame. She was smiling, holding her pom-poms up in the air, her blonde hair caught in the wind. Toby stared at the screen, tears immediately welling up in his eyes. He reached out and touched the glass of the monitor, completely overwhelmed by seeing his sister frozen in time, completely unaware that she only had a few hours left to live. Toby sat in the dark room and cried quietly for a few minutes. Then, he wiped his eyes and clicked to the next photograph in the sequence. The student photographer had been using a long zoom lens, rapidly clicking the shutter to capture the action on the sidelines. Photograph 43 showed Delaney turning around, walking toward the wooden bench where the cheerleaders kept their heavy bags. Photograph 44 showed Delaney running back onto the field to perform a routine, leaving her black and orange bag sitting, completely unattended on the edge of the bench. Toby clicked to photograph 45. The camera focus was slightly blurred, aimed at the football players on the field, but the wooden cheer bench was still clearly visible in the deep background of the shot. Toby leaned closer to the monitor. His eyes narrowed. Standing directly behind the wooden bench, standing dangerously close to Delaney's unattended bag, was the large, blurry figure of a man wearing a heavy winter coat. Toby's pulse began to hammer in his ears. He quickly clicked to photograph 46. It was taken just 1 second later. In this frame, the large man was leaning heavily over the wooden bench. His face was entirely cut off by the upper edge of the camera frame, completely obscuring his identity. But his right arm was extended downward, reaching directly into Delaney's open bag. And pinched between the man's large fingers was a distinct, square white envelope. Toby stopped breathing. He was looking at the exact moment the blackmailer planted the terrifying note in his sister's bag. He was looking at a photograph of the man who had likely killed Delaney later that night. Toby's hands flew across the keyboard. He used the digital archive software to crop the image, focusing entirely on the deep background of the shot. He enlarged the image by 400%, applying a digital sharpening filter to clear up the blur from the old camera lens. The computer processed the image for a few agonizing seconds, and then the pixels slowly snapped into sharp focus. The man's face was still out of frame, but his massive right hand was now perfectly visible on the glowing screen. The hand was huge, entirely consistent with the heavy, smeared handprints found on the frosted glass of Delaney's car window. But what made Toby's blood turn to ice was the specific detail resting on the man's finger. The man was wearing a very distinct, incredibly heavy gold college championship ring. The ring featured a large, square black onyx stone in the center, surrounded by thick gold lettering. It was not a cheap, generic piece of jewelry. It was a rare, custom-made ring that would be impossible to mistake for anything else. Toby didn't waste a single second. He printed out the high-resolution cropped image, grabbed his coat, and ran out of the school basement. He got into his car and drove straight through the pouring rain to the other side of town. He pulled up to a small, quiet house with a well-kept lawn. Detective Aris Gable had retired from the police force 2 years earlier. He was an older man now, walking with a slight limp, but his mind was just as sharp as it had been in 1997. When Gable opened his front door and saw the frantic, desperate look on Toby's face, he didn't even ask what was going on. He just stepped aside and let Toby into the living room. Toby threw the printed photograph down on the detective's coffee table. He quickly explained the basement archive project, the unpublished negatives, and the sequence of the photographs. Gable put on his reading glasses and stared at the image of the massive hand slipping the white envelope into the cheer bag. The retired detective let out a long, heavy breath, heavily leaning back into his armchair. For 15 years, he had wondered how the blackmailer managed to slip the note into her bag without anyone noticing. Now, he was staring right at the answer. Gable walked over to a heavy wooden bookshelf in the corner of his living room. He pulled down a pristine, plastic-wrapped copy of the 1997 Massillon High School yearbook. He brought it back to the coffee table and opened it to the faculty and staff section. If you want more emotional cold case stories like this, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. If this man was on the sidelines during a heavily guarded football game, and he felt comfortable enough to lean over the cheer bench in front of thousands of people without looking suspicious, Gable said, his voice low and serious, then he wasn't a stranger. He belonged there. He was someone the students trusted. Toby and Gable sat shoulder to shoulder, slowly turning the glossy pages of the old yearbook. They scanned the portraits of the teachers, the administrators, and the coaching staff. They were looking for one specific, undeniable detail. They checked the hands resting on the laps of the faculty members. They checked the candid photos of the teachers at their desks. They reached page 42. It was the section dedicated to the school's elective instructors. Gable's finger suddenly stopped moving. He tapped the page, his face completely draining of color. Staring back at them from the yearbook page was the smiling, friendly face of Mr. Harold Miller. Mr. Miller was a heavily built man with a booming voice and a reputation for being incredibly strict but deeply caring. He was the school's longtime driver's education instructor. In his official staff portrait, Mr. Miller had his arms crossed over his chest, proudly resting his massive hands on his sleeves. And shining perfectly under the studio lights, resting on his right ring finger, was the massive gold college championship ring with the square black onyx stone. Toby felt a wave of absolute shock wash over him. Mr. Miller had taught Delaney how to drive. He was a trusted, respected member of the Massillon community. It seemed completely impossible that this beloved teacher was the monster who had terrorized and kidnapped a 17-year-old girl. But Detective Gable was not looking at the ring anymore. He was staring blindly at the wall, a look of profound horror washing over his aged face as a massive, horrifying realization finally clicked into place. His mind raced back to the exact wording of the blackmail note. "I know what you did last summer." Gable slowly turned to look at Toby. His voice was barely a whisper. "In July of 1997, Gable said, his eyes filled with dread, a young boy riding his bicycle on a rural county road outside of town was struck and killed by a vehicle. The driver fled the scene, and the police never found the car. It was the biggest unsolved hit-and-run in the county's history." Toby stared at him, not entirely understanding the connection. "Toby," Gable continued, his voice shaking with the weight of the 15-year-old secret. "During the summer of 1997, your sister was enrolled in the school's summer driving program, and the instructor who sat in the passenger seat with her every single day was Harold Miller." Toby sat completely frozen on Detective Gable's living room couch, the vintage school yearbook resting heavily on his lap. The realization of what he was looking at felt like all the air had been suddenly pulled from the room. Mr. Miller, the strict but beloved driver's education teacher, the man who had sat in the passenger seat of a white training sedan and taught hundreds of local teenagers how to drive, including Delaney. Detective Gable walked over to his large front window, staring out at the pouring rain, his mind working furiously to connect the terrifying dots. He slowly began to explain the dark, tragic reality of the summer of 1997. In July of that year, an 11-year-old boy was riding his bicycle on a quiet, rural road just a few miles outside of Massillon. He was struck from behind by a vehicle that never even tapped its brakes. The boy did not survive. The driver fled the scene, leaving the local police with absolutely nothing to go on, except for a few deep scrapes of white automotive paint transferred onto the metal frame of the crushed bicycle. The police had searched for a white pickup truck or a large white van, but they never found a match. They had completely overlooked the school district's small fleet of white Ford Taurus sedans, specifically used for the summer driver's education program. Gable turned back to face Toby, his eyes filled with a heartbreaking sorrow. He explained how dual-control training cars worked. The instructor sitting in the passenger seat had their own brake pedal. They were supposed to be the safety net, the responsible adult who could stop the car if a young student made a dangerous mistake. Gable laid out the horrifying theory. What if Mr. Miller had been distracted? What if he had fallen asleep or worse, had been drinking from a hidden flask? When the terrible accident happened, Miller could have slammed on his instructor brake, but he failed. Instead of taking responsibility and losing his career, his pension, and his freedom, Miller did something unspeakably evil. He turned to the terrified, hyperventilating 17-year-old girl sitting behind the steering wheel, and he blamed the entire tragedy on her. He likely convinced Delaney that she would be tried as an adult, that she would go to prison for vehicular manslaughter, and that her single mother would be sued and completely ruined. In the panic of the moment, surrounded by the dark, empty rural road, Miller took a Polaroid photograph of Delaney standing next to the dented white bumper. It was his insurance policy, a way to completely trap a vulnerable child in a web of guilt and silence. Toby buried his face in his hands, completely overwhelmed by the crushing weight of the truth. It all made horrifying sense now. Delaney's strange behavior in the weeks leading up to her disappearance wasn't about the stress of college applications. It wasn't about a secret boyfriend. She was an innocent teenage girl being eaten alive from the inside out by the guilt of believing she had killed a young boy. She jumped every time the phone rang because she thought it was the police coming to arrest her. She pulled the curtains closed because she was terrified the boy's family was watching her. And Cameron, her boyfriend, had said that on the night of the football game, Delaney had finally reached her breaking point. She had promised to tell him everything at the diner. She was ready to confess. She couldn't carry the horrific secret anymore. But Miller knew she was cracking. He watched her every single day in the school hallways. He saw the heavy bags under her eyes and the nervous way she looked around. Recognizing that his own freedom was in jeopardy, Miller used the chaos of the crowded Friday night football game to lean over the wooden cheer bench and drop the typed extortion note into her bag. He knew the threat of showing the photographs to the police would force her to walk out to the dark, empty student parking lot alone. Detective Gable didn't wait until morning. He picked up his phone and called the current Massillon chief of police, a man named Henderson, who had been a young rookie officer during the original 1997 search. Within 30 minutes, Chief Henderson arrived at Gable's house. When he saw the high-resolution digital crop of the massive gold championship ring and compared it to Mr. Miller's faculty portrait in the yearbook, the chief's face turned bright red with anger. The timeline, the hit-and-run connection, and the physical evidence of the ring were completely undeniable. By sunrise on Wednesday morning, Chief Henderson had woken up a local county judge and secured a full, emergency search warrant for Harold Miller's property. Miller was now 65 years old. He had quietly retired from the school district 5 years earlier and lived alone on a sprawling, 20-acre farm heavily surrounded by dense woods, located about 20 miles outside of the Massillon city limits. Toby desperately wanted to go with the police. He stood up from the couch, his fists clenched, ready to confront the man who had destroyed his family. But Detective Gable gently placed a hand on his shoulder. He looked Toby in the eyes and told him to go home. He told him to sit with his mother, Lorraine, and hold her hand. The absolute truth was coming today, and Lorraine shouldn't be sitting in that house alone when the news finally broke. Toby reluctantly agreed, driving back to his childhood home with a heavy, anxious heart. Detective Gable, acting as a sworn civilian consultant for the department, rode in the passenger seat of Chief Henderson's lead cruiser. A massive convoy of unmarked police SUVs, state trooper vehicles, and a heavily armed tactical unit rolled quietly out of the station parking lot. They drove in complete radio silence through the pouring spring rain, moving swiftly down the slick country highways toward Miller's isolated farm. The property was a long, narrow stretch of land entirely hidden from the main road by a thick wall of pine trees. The police cruisers turned down a muddy, unpaved driveway, their tires splashing through deep puddles. At the end of the driveway sat a run-down, two-story farmhouse. The front porch was sagging, and the yard was littered with rusted farming equipment. The tactical team moved with swift, silent precision. They stacked up against the front door, heavy ballistic shields raised. With 3 loud, powerful strikes from a steel battering ram, the front door splintered open. The officers flooded into the house, shouting commands, their weapons drawn, sweeping every room in seconds. Harold Miller was sitting quietly at a small wooden table in his kitchen. He was drinking a cup of black coffee, wearing a faded flannel shirt. He didn't jump when the door was smashed open. He didn't raise his hands in a panic. He simply placed his coffee mug down on the table and stared at the heavily armed officers filling his kitchen. His eyes were completely cold, hollow, and utterly arrogant. He looked like a man who had spent 15 years believing he was entirely untouchable. Chief Henderson stepped into the kitchen, followed closely by Detective Gable. When Miller saw Gable's aged, familiar face, a slight muscle twitched in his jaw, but he remained completely silent. The officers forcefully pulled Miller out of his chair, secured his massive hands behind his back with heavy steel handcuffs, and read him his rights. Miller refused to speak a single word. He did not ask for a lawyer, and he did not ask why they were there. He just stared blankly ahead as they marched him out into the pouring rain and placed him into the back of a police cruiser. With the suspect secured, the massive forensic search of the property began. Dozens of technicians in white protective suits swarmed the farmhouse. They tore through his bedroom, ripped up the floorboards, and emptied every filing cabinet in his home office. But after 3 exhausting hours of searching, they found absolutely nothing. There were no photographs, no typed notes, and no hidden trophies in the house. It was entirely clean. Detective Gable walked out the back door of the kitchen, pulling his raincoat tight against the cold wind. He stood on the muddy back porch, surveying the vast, overgrown backyard. About 200 yards away, sitting near the absolute edge of the property line, completely obscured by a row of dead oak trees, was a massive, dilapidated wooden barn. The roof was partially caved in, and the red paint had almost entirely peeled away. But as Gable walked closer, his boots sinking deep into the wet mud, he noticed something incredibly strange about the old, rotting structure. The heavy wooden double doors at the front of the barn were secured by three massive, brand-new, hardened steel padlocks. They were heavy-duty commercial locks, completely out of place on a ruined, abandoned outbuilding. Gable called for the tactical team. Two officers jogged over with heavy steel bolt cutters. It took immense physical effort to snap the thick metal shackles, the loud cracks echoing across the rainy farm. Once the locks were broken, the officers grabbed the heavy iron handles and pulled the barn doors open. The interior of the barn was pitch black. The air smelled strongly of old dust, damp wood, and the faint, unmistakable chemical scent of gasoline. As the officers switched on their heavy tactical flashlights, the bright white beams cut through the darkness, illuminating the center of the dirt floor. Sitting directly in the middle of the barn, completely covered by a massive, heavy-duty canvas tarp, was a vehicle. Chief Henderson stepped forward, grabbing the corner of the dusty canvas tarp. With one strong pull, he dragged the heavy fabric backward, exposing the car underneath. It was a 1997 white Ford Taurus sedan. Detective Gable felt a cold shiver run down his spine. It was the exact make, model, and color of the vehicles used by the Massillon High School Driver's Education Program. The police immediately ran the vehicle identification number stamped on the dashboard. The radio dispatcher confirmed their worst fears. The car had been officially retired from the school district fleet and sold at a public surplus auction in 1999. The registered buyer was Harold Miller. Miller hadn't just kept his terrible secret. He had actively purchased the murder weapon used in the fatal hit-and-run to ensure the police could never, ever test the white paint on the front bumper. He had locked it away in the darkness of his barn, a permanent, hidden monument to the lives he had destroyed. The forensic team immediately moved in. They photographed every inch of the dusty white sedan. They carefully opened the driver's side door, dusting the interior for prints. But Detective Gable's attention was entirely focused on the back of the car. He pointed his flashlight at the trunk, gesturing for the lead forensic technician to open it. The technician used a specialized lock-picking tool to pop the trunk mechanism. With a loud, rusty squeak, the trunk lid slowly rose into the air. Gable and Chief Henderson stepped closer, shining their lights into the deep, dark cavity of the trunk. It was not empty. Resting perfectly in the center of the trunk's carpeted floor was a heavy, fireproof metal security box. It was the kind of lockbox used to protect important legal documents from house fires, and it was heavily locked. Chief Henderson didn't wait for a key. He grabbed a heavy iron crowbar from the tactical truck, wedged the curved end under the metal lid of the lockbox, and pushed down with all his weight. The metal hinges groaned in protest before finally snapping with a loud crack. The lid popped open. Inside the box were the answers to 15 years of absolute agony. Lying flat on top of a small stack of papers was a single, faded Polaroid photograph. Detective Gable put on a pair of latex gloves and carefully picked it up. His heart shattered. The photograph showed a terrified, hyperventilating Delaney Vance. She was standing on the side of a dark rural road in the summer of 1997, her hands covering her mouth in pure horror. Directly next to her was the front bumper of the white Ford Taurus, clearly showing a massive, fresh dent on the passenger side. It was the ultimate proof of the extortion, the exact photograph Miller had threatened to show the police. Gable looked back down into the metal box. Lying directly underneath, the Polaroid was a set of familiar keys on a braided black and orange cheerleading keychain. They were Delaney's missing car keys. The physical proof that Miller had been the man standing outside her faded blue sedan in the freezing parking lot, demanding she step out of the vehicle and locking the doors behind her. But it was the final object resting at the very bottom of the metal lockbox that made the entire barn go completely, terrifyingly silent. It was a small, black microcassette audio tape. Written across the faded white plastic label in thick black marker was a single date: October 17, 1997. Chief Henderson sprinted back to his police cruiser, grabbing a battery-powered tape recorder from his center console. He ran back into the dusty barn, his hands shaking slightly as he slid the small black cassette into the machine. He pressed the play button, turning the volume dial all the way up. The tape began to hiss with the sound of old static. Then, the distinct, rushing sound of freezing autumn wind howling through a parking lot filled the barn. Heavy footsteps crunched against cold pavement. And then, echoing through the silence of the barn, came the terrified, trembling voice of Delaney Vance. She was crying, begging Mr. Miller to let her go, promising that she would never tell anyone about the accident. But as the tape continued to play, capturing the horrifying final moments of the missing cheerleader, the audio revealed exactly what the monster had done in the dark, and it pointed directly to the terrible, lonely place where the nightmare had finally ended. The hissing static of the microcassette tape echoed through the damp, quiet barn, sending a chilling wave of horror over every officer standing in the room. Through the small speaker of the battery-powered recorder, the terrifying final moments of Delaney Vance played out with devastating clarity. Delaney's voice was completely broken. She was crying hysterically, her breath catching in her throat as she begged Mr. Miller to let her go home. She promised over and over again that she would never tell the police about the hit and run, that she would take the secret to her grave, and that he didn't need to do this. But Harold Miller's voice, captured perfectly on the magnetic tape, was completely devoid of human empathy. He spoke in a low, calm, terrifyingly calculated tone. He told Delaney that she was too young and too weak to carry a secret that heavy. He told her that eventually, the guilt would eat her alive, and she would confess. And he was not going to spend the rest of his life in a concrete prison cell just because a teenage girl couldn't hold her nerve. The tape captured the sound of heavy footsteps crunching across wet leaves and snapping twigs. Miller had forced Delaney out of his vehicle and was marching her through the thick, overgrown woods. A few seconds later, the audio picked up the loud, heavy scraping sound of thick metal dragging across stone. It sounded like a massive iron lid being pulled open. "No one comes out to the old stone cistern, Delaney," Miller's voice echoed coldly on the tape. "It's been dry for 40 years. You can scream all you want down here. Nobody is ever going to hear you." Delaney began to scream, a sound of absolute, primal terror that made Chief Henderson tightly close his eyes and look away. Then came the sound of a heavy iron grate slamming shut with a violent, metallic crash. The heavy clank of a thick steel padlock clicking into place echoed through the speaker. Delaney's muffled cries could still be heard, faint and distant, echoing from deep underground. And then Miller simply turned off the recorder. The tape ended, leaving the barn in a suffocating, heavy silence. The pouring rain drumming against the rotting wooden roof was the only sound left. Harold Miller had not just killed a teenage girl to protect his pension. He was a deeply sadistic monster who had recorded her final moments of terror to keep as a sick, twisted trophy of his ultimate control. He had locked a vibrant, beautiful 17-year-old cheerleader in the total darkness of an abandoned underground well, leaving her completely alone in the freezing cold. Chief Henderson immediately raised his radio to his mouth, his voice shaking with furious urgency. He ordered the entire tactical team to spread out across the 20-acre farm. They were looking for an old, dried-up stone cistern hidden somewhere in the dense brush. For the next 2 hours, the police officers marched shoulder to shoulder through the freezing spring rain, using long metal poles to probe the deep, overgrown grass behind the farmhouse. They pushed through thick thorn bushes and overturned rusted farming equipment. Finally, near the very back edge of the property line, where the forest grew thick and dark, a state trooper shouted out to the rest of the team, His metal pole had struck something solid and hollow beneath a massive pile of dead, rotting branches. Detective Gable and Chief Henderson rushed through the mud toward the tree line. The officers quickly cleared away the heavy branches and the thick layers of dead leaves, revealing a massive, rusted iron hatch bolted into a circular stone foundation. It was an antique water cistern, long abandoned and completely forgotten by the modern world. And securing the heavy iron latch was a thick, hardened steel padlock. The tactical team brought over the heavy bolt cutters. With a loud, sharp crack, the padlock was severed. It took 3 heavily built officers to grip the rusted iron handles and pull the massive hatch open. A rush of stale, damp air rose up from the darkness below. Chief Henderson aimed his heavy tactical flashlight down into the deep, stone-lined shaft. At the bottom of the dry well, resting peacefully in the dark, they finally found her. 15 years after she had walked away from the bright lights of the high school football stadium, Delaney Vance was located. She was still wearing her black and orange cheerleading uniform. There was no need for the officers to say a word. The long, agonizing search was officially over. Delaney was going home. While the state medical examiner and the forensic recovery team carefully began the solemn process of bringing Delaney out of the darkness, Detective Gable slowly walked back to the police cruisers. He did not want to make a phone call. After 15 years of looking Lorraine Vance in the eye and promising her that he would never stop searching, he knew he had to deliver the final news in person. The drive back into Massillon felt like it took a lifetime. The rain continued to fall over the quiet town, washing the streets clean. Gable pulled his unmarked car into the driveway of the modest Vance home. The front porch light was on, cutting through the gray afternoon. When Gable knocked on the front door, Toby answered immediately. The young history teacher took one look at the exhausted, heartbreaking expression on the retired detective's face, and he knew instantly. Toby's eyes filled with tears and he stepped back, holding the door open. Lorraine was sitting on the living room couch, clutching a tissue in her hands. When Detective Gable walked into the room and took off his wet hat, Lorraine stood up. She didn't ask what they had found. She didn't ask if her daughter was alive. A mother's heart always knows when the waiting is finally over. She let out a soft, broken gasp, her knees buckling beneath her. Toby rushed forward, catching his mother in his arms as she collapsed against his chest, sobbing uncontrollably. Gable stood in the living room, his own tears silently falling, offering no empty words of comfort. There was nothing to say that could take away the pain of losing a child, but beneath the devastating, crushing weight of the grief, there was also a sudden, profound shift in the energy of the room. The agonizing torture of ambiguous loss, the late-night wondering, the endless staring at the front door, the terrifying nightmares of the unknown was finally over. They had the truth. They had the monster in handcuffs. And most importantly, they finally had Delaney back. The news of Harold Miller's arrest sent a massive shockwave through the entire town of Massillon. The community was absolutely devastated. Miller had been a pillar of the high school, a man trusted to sit in the passenger seat with their children. When the public learned about the 1997 hit and run, and how Miller had framed a terrified teenage girl to save himself, the town's collective heartbreak turned into absolute, unyielding fury. The district attorney did not offer a single plea deal for leniency. Miller was indicted on charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping, extortion, and vehicular manslaughter. Facing a mountain of undeniable physical evidence, the hidden hit-and-run vehicle, the Polaroid photograph, the cheerleader's car keys, and the devastating microcassette tape, Miller's expensive defense attorneys realized they had absolutely no way to win a trial. The evidence was bulletproof. 9 months later, heavily shackled and wearing a bright orange prison jumpsuit, Harold Miller stood in a packed Ohio courtroom. He looked old, frail, and entirely defeated. The arrogant monster who had hidden behind a respectable career for 15 years was entirely exposed to the world. Terrified of facing the death penalty in a highly publicized trial, Miller officially pleaded guilty to all charges. During the sentencing hearing, the courtroom was completely silent as Toby Vance walked up to the podium to deliver his family's victim impact statement. Toby stood tall, a respected teacher in the very same school where his sister's life was stolen. He looked directly at the man who had caused his family so much pain. Miller refused to meet his eyes, staring down at the heavy wooden table. "You thought you were a genius," Toby said, his voice echoing clearly through the quiet room. "You thought you had perfectly manipulated a teenage girl, and you thought you had outsmarted the entire police force. You locked my sister in the dark because you believed that if nobody could hear her, the truth would simply disappear. But you forgot one thing, Mr. Miller. The truth doesn't need a voice to survive. It waits. It hides in the shadows of a camera negative. It waits in the dust of an old yearbook. You took everything from my sister, but in the end, it was a single photograph. A photograph you didn't even know existed, that brought you down." The judge showed absolutely no mercy. Harold Miller was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was heavily escorted out of the courtroom, destined to spend the rest of his natural life locked in a small, concrete cell, utterly alone, entirely stripped of the power and control he had craved so deeply. With the legal battle finally over, the Vance family could focus on honoring the beautiful life that had been so violently interrupted. On a bright, clear Saturday morning in the spring of 2013, the town of Massillon gathered at the historic local cemetery. The turnout was massive. Hundreds of people, including former students, retired teachers, and the police officers who had never given up on the case, stood respectfully on the green grass. The entire 1997 Massillon High School cheerleading squad, now grown women in their 30s, returned to stand together near the front of the crowd. Cameron Pierce, no longer an arrogant teenage quarterback but a quiet, humbled father of two, stood near the back, wiping away tears as he finally said goodbye to his first love. The memorial service was beautiful. It wasn't focused on the darkness of Delaney's final night, but on the incredible light she had brought into the world during her 17 years. Toby spoke about her infectious laugh, her dedication to her family, and the deep, unwavering love she had for her mother. When the service concluded, Delaney Vance walked slowly up to the beautiful, polished marble headstone. She reached out, her trembling fingers gently tracing the engraved letters of her daughter's name. For 15 years, Lorraine had lived in a frozen nightmare, unable to move forward, unable to let go. But as she placed a single, perfect white rose on the soft green grass, a profound sense of peace finally washed over her. She knew exactly where her daughter was resting. Delaney was no longer lost in the cold, dark woods. She was surrounded by the people who loved her, resting in the warm sunlight of her hometown. The story of the Massillon cheerleader who vanished after a Friday night football game became a defining piece of history for the small Ohio town. It was a terrifying reminder that the most dangerous monsters in our society do not always hide in dark alleyways or break through our windows in the middle of the night. Sometimes, they are the people standing in front of a classroom. Sometimes, they are the people wearing championship rings, hiding their absolute cruelty behind a mask of authority and trust. But it was also a story about the unstoppable, immortal nature of the truth. A guilty man can build a fortress of lies. He can bury the evidence in a ruined barn. He can lock the secrets away in a fireproof box. And he can walk through the world for 15 years believing he has completely gotten away with it. He can silence the witnesses and hide in plain sight. But time has a way of eroding even the deepest secrets. The truth does not care about heavy steel padlocks, and it does not care how many years have passed. It simply waits. It waits for a dedicated detective who refuses to close a file. It waits for a grieving brother scanning old film in a dusty basement. And eventually, the truth always rises from the dark, completely breaking the silence and finally bringing the lost ones home.